movements that are taking place right now. Really take some time to read this book. And I'm really grateful that some of my stories are shared in there, but also stories of so many incredible and inspiring people. And this question, Rachel, that you've asked is something that's really dear to me and really goes to how I began my journey. So, as you know, or some of you may know, that my work is really around helping professionals break unconscious bias. So, racial bias, gender bias, so we can create a world where there's more equity and belonging. And for me, that work is, of course, I have all the degrees and I've studied this very intimately, but it really started because of my personal journey. And that personal journey was really around feeling separate. I felt separate because of the way I look, because of my race, my ethnicity, my religious background, my immigration status, my sexuality, my gender. So there were so many ways that the society in which I lived and I grew up in, I grew up in India until I was 10 years old, and I moved to New York City and grew up here for the remainder of my time, just feeling the sense of not belonging. And I think the beauty of this book and of mindfulness practice for me is really around understanding that nothing operates in isolation. One of the things, and I practice the Dharma, so I know that one of the quotes that I love by the Buddha is, I hope I get this right, is this is because that is, and that is because this is, right? So it's literally like what he's describing is interconnection, interdependence. And for me personally, of course, there's been a lot of wounding that I experienced because of my various, demographic identities or psychographic identities. But the people that helped me through it, the books, the podcasts, the movies, the friends, the mentors, the teachers, came from all different backgrounds. So even if I had racial wounding, it was actually a lot of people like my Susan Davis, who's like my mentor, my friend, my angel, I would even say, here she is, a white woman, right? Externally, but I am because of her and she is because of me. So that element of interdependence has been really, really transformative for me. And I think for my work around breaking unconscious bias, it really starts there. It starts with mindfulness, and it starts with helping people become aware of that interdependence. And of course, then moving into hard practices like compassion and empathy and joy, and really building those as skills um, to live a more fulfilling life, together.
So those skills are not so easy. I mean, how do we look at these as skills? These sound like grandiose ideas.
Okay. I'd love to Sharon to pop in here because she's been doing this and teaching folks for 40, 50 plus years. But I think the only thing I would say is, yes, they're not easy, but they're simple. So, and
That's
they,
good.
they're simple, they're straightforward. And the way we do it, basically based on the science, is that we've created a framework of PRISM. So PRISM is an acronym for 5 of these tools: perspective taking, pro-social behaviors, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness. And if one thinks about these tools, all of this really starts with mindfulness. And mindfulness, the way I like to just describe it, is the act of noticing or remembering. That's it. So if a stereotype arises, we notice it. We don't push it away. If shame arises as a result of it, we notice that too. And then we kind of build up to, replacing those stereotypes, again, rewiring the brain, to then moving into individuation, which is, decoupling these group-based stereotypes from the individual. And that is also known as curiosity, you know? And then we move to these tools around pro-social behaviors and perspective taking, which are really hard practices. In the Buddhist tradition, these are known as the Brahma Viharas, things around metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, equanimity, peka, and mudita, which is joy, but also things like gratitude, generosity. And that's where we're kind of really, building capacity of our heart to really hold the suffering that of ourselves and other beings, and then use that capacity to act.
Well, one of the things I really love about Anu's work is that he's taken a very classical model and made it understandable and relevant for today's world in a way that doesn't, in my view, doesn't lose anything. You know, it reflects so strongly back to how I was taught in India, those many years ago, where, you know, these days the word mindfulness, of course, is very popular. When I came back from India as a meditation teacher, it was 1974, and nobody ever used the word. They didn't think of meditation as something kind of scientific. It was considered very odd and exotic and woo woo in a way. Um, but as mindfulness has gotten much more popular, I think that what has been most strongly emphasized is a benefit that's hugely important for us, but is not a complete picture. And that is a sense of fully inhabiting our lives, to, you know, really experience drinking that cup of tea, because for once we're not multitasking and we're not hugely distracted, and we are more completely present with our experience, which makes quite an enormous difference in our level of fulfillment and happiness and so on. But classically, mindfulness was designed to not only have us inhabit our lives more fully, but to understand our lives.
Mm.
It actually was a compound. It's sati, which is mindfulness, sampajanya, which means clear comprehension.
Mhm.
And that's how I was taught. So all those things Anu was saying, like perspective taking and seeing, you know, the stories that maybe others have told about us that we have absorbed and we've kind of come to believe, we get enough space from what is arising in our minds that we can see that is a story. And is it true? You know, we don't have to dismiss it out of hand, but we get to have that curiosity. Is it true? Is it just something that I have absorbed? And we get to see the paths we have undertaken, maybe habitually, of separation or disconnection or whatever it might be that we think make us strong and happy. We take a look and like, really? Is that true? Or maybe these other qualities, these more heartful qualities like compassion, which perhaps we have been taught are kind of stupid, or, you know, people will just take advantage of you. Or even now I'm told, you know, if you put in a word in search in Google, Google will offer you suggestions because they think, well, this is so likely what you are searching for because so many others have searched for that very thing. I'm told that if you type in compassion, you'll get fatigue right away
Oh my
because they
God.
think you're interested in compassion fatigue because so many people are. Um, you know, we get to see for ourselves. It's like we in meditation, we are our own laboratory. We get to see for ourselves, and that's why I think it can have an influence, an effect on what we call implicit bias or unconscious bias because it's no longer unconscious.
Yeah. And that's so beautiful, Sharon, because that is the work of mindfulness. You know, basically, we're making the unconscious conscious. And once we make the unconscious conscious, we can't forget it, right? And that is what allows us to begin to shift our mindsets, shift our habits, and then shift our behavior. And I think at this time, we're being called to do that together in community. So, you know, it's interesting. I've been talking to a lot of young people who are on the streets right now. And of course, I also talk to older generations of activists and advocates whose shoulders we really stand on. And there's this interesting tension that's coming up because the old model around social movements is that we need a leader, right? So civil rights leader, you know, women's rights, women's liberation, gay liberation, all of these movements had like specific, um, you know, figureheads that really led them. And what's happening right now with a lot of young people, and you know, I consider myself on the older end of these young people, no longer in my 20s, is that this is becoming more of a leaderless movement in the sense that so many people are doing this work themselves. And what's beautiful about what you shared, Sharon, is, and I'd love for you to, you know, share more about what it was like for you to be in India, you know, in your early days, particularly coming in as a Westerner, as someone who was the age of a lot of young people who are on the streets right now. You're like, what brought you there, and what, how did it help you heal? But the last thing I want to just say is that in Asian languages, I speak Hindi mostly, but I've learned Korean and some Burmese in the past. The word for mind isn't mind; it's actually mind heart. So like when I say like in Hindi it's man, it actually means mind and heart. So when we actually are saying mindfulness, when we're translating that, it's actually mind dash heartfulness, and I think it sometimes doesn't get captured um, right now. So would love for you actually, but using that, I'd love to like hear and really be. I think for me, for personally, for my personal reasons, just what that was like for you as a young person.
Yeah, well, I was 18 when I went to India. I am a product of the New York City public school systems, which meant I skipped 2 grades. And so I went to college when I was 16, and I went to India in my junior year of college. It was sort of like my junior year abroad. I created an independent study project because I so wanted to learn how to meditate, having taken an Asian philosophy course as a sophomore. And it's a remarkable moment. I look back on it often, like, why didn't I say, I think I'll study this further, or maybe I'll go to graduate school and emphasize this, or whatever. I thought, no, I've got to learn how to do it. And obviously that was the critical moment of my life. And I created this project. I said, I want to go to India and learn how to meditate. And they said, okay. This was 1970, and education was kind of like that in those days more. And so I went, and I was very interested in the practical, direct teaching of how to. I wasn't particularly interested in the philosophy or assuming an identity or rejecting anything else, but I wanted to learn how to. And that got me out of New York City and Buffalo, where I was going to college, to India. I had never even been to California before. I had to go. And I was, I think, I was also very moved, Anu, by what you were saying earlier about belonging, because I think that was the central issue of my life, as it is for many people. I'd had a very traumatic childhood with a lot of disruption. My family didn't look like other families, and it was very painful for me. And it was also the case that, like for many people, my family system was one where these things were never spoken about. Like my mother died when I was 9 and my father was gone. It was very complex. And so all of those feelings I had inside were not getting any external affirmation. And it was only actually when I did this Asian philosophy class and I heard of the Buddha's teaching where he said there is suffering in life, which did not seem to me a depressing message. It was very liberating. It was like, oh, it's not just me. I'm not so weird. I'm not different. This is a part of life. And again, it's often in that recognition of the universality. Not that we all suffer to the same degree, but we're all so vulnerable. I mean, look at this time. And we can find one another in that vulnerability. And that's what happened to me. I had a sense of belonging and not being on the margins for the first time in my life. And I think that's part of what happens in the process of meditating, because there are many stories that have been told about each of us that we do absorb. And I was actually in Kentucky teaching with Bell Hooks at her institute. And I said that, because it's one of the themes that I really like to explore. And somebody in the group said, well, I don't believe that. Other people don't tell stories about us. Like, they don't know us. How could they be telling a story about us? And I said, everything tells a story about us. Architecture tells a story about us. Do you belong? Do you not belong? Everything, there's such a massive amount of input. And to get to realize that, oh, my sense of belonging, of feeling at home in this body or in this mind or on this earth, actually doesn't depend on that externalized, now internalized view. It's something else I can find that where I can declare that. One of the things I loved when you held up the cover of the book, because a character in my book, as well as quoting you and Susan Davis, another wonderful activist, is the Statue of Liberty, because the Statue of Liberty is my icon. And I love that message. You belong, no matter who you are, how wretched, and how poor. It doesn't matter. You belong. There's a home here for you. And somebody pointed out to me that the color of the cover of the book is the same color as the Statue of Liberty. So yes. I was exceedingly happy.
Not a coincidence at all, in that way. And I think it's like the word liberty and belonging are so interconnected, right? Because I think oftentimes we feel that we don't have the liberty to be our true self, and thereby we don't feel like we belong. And thank you for sharing that story. And I can really resonate with that myself, because, for such a long time, I didn't feel like I belonged. Forget the world, forget the societies I was growing up, or the family dysfunction. And because my family immigrated to the US, there was a lot of disruption there. But I didn't feel like I belonged to my body. I remember that, after college, I lived in Korea for a year. I was teaching English there. And that was when I really began practicing mindfulness more consistently. And this one time, I was taking this interesting mixed martial arts class, and I would go to my sonsengnim, that's the word for teacher in Korean. And for the first 5 minutes, he would like hold my shoulders and pull them down. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, I didn't know, because like I was like this. And God knows how long I like lived my life like this. And I remember, like I so remember this. I started practicing yoga regularly, and this was my third year in law school. So this was like 2010 or something. I was in Shavasana at the end of the class, and I got up and I literally felt this. And that moment I freaked out. I'm like, did anyone see that? Like, what just happened? But I think for me, after practicing for so long, and being consistent around it, something in my body that was unconsciously holding all of the ways I felt like I didn't belong, finally felt like it belonged. And I think that was like a really powerful moment for me.
I'm really curious, because this is a very personal story, but it has led you to the work that you're doing. So how do you make that change from something that you discover that's so intrinsic to who you are, to something that you can share that then can become part of a larger movement, as it were?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, so there's two parts of the story. So the first part is that because I felt like I didn't belong in this body, I went through a massive depression in my early 20s. No one knew about it because I was just holding up appearances. I was, and of course, being born male, there was a lot of expectations, particularly in an Indian immigrant family, that I had to be tough. But inside, I was like, craving for help, but I couldn't show it. So I actually came to a head and I attempted suicide. I think it was the beginning of my second year of law school, but thankfully I didn't. And this is because I credit this to grace, to mindfulness, because the moment I was about to do it, I began seeing thoughts in my mind and became so acutely aware of thoughts. And in that moment, I was like, wait, if these are thoughts, who am I? And if these thoughts are telling me to do this, who am I, right? So that's when I kind of got off the ledge. And of course, immediately got help, and have, been, practicing various tools to really understand all of these issues. But it became connected to social movements for me. The following year, I was working in New Orleans. And, I went to law school still wanting to do international development, international human rights work. And the interesting thing was I was working in the New Orleans prisons and court system. And this one time I was noticing, literally young Black boys, 15, 16 years of age, being sentenced to prison for 3, 4, 5 years at a time for incredibly petty things, things like breaking cell phones, trespass to property. And of course, most of these, I would say, young people were from lower class backgrounds. And the moral disgust I felt in my belly as someone who was studying the law, wanting to uphold justice, was worse than what I felt like when I lived and worked in Myanmar, an autocratic country. And of course, when I visited even North Korea, as a tourist. And that's because for me, what I love about America is that we uphold these values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the sense of equality and justice. Yet it was just so egregiously opposite to that. And that's what really began my journey around understanding the nature of racial bias and racism. And the more I wanted to lead into the conversation, the more I learned that these issues have been going on for so long. And there are a lot of systemic challenges, systemic racism that is in place. So for me, I was like, well, okay, as an academic, I can talk about the cerebral stuff, but what do we do about it? I'm like very much like, okay, I need solutions. And that's where I began to really, lean back into the work of, Dr. King, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. And even though they didn't have the same language as Sharon does or Joseph does, they were talking about mindfulness. They were talking about how we need to create a personal transformation within us to overcome these stories of otherness, to really feel our own humanity. And once we can begin to shift that mindset within ourselves, that's when we begin to build a movement and connect with other like-minded people to address more of the systemic challenges. And as a lawyer, I know that to be true because I tried to work in the law for several years. And I saw that we have some of the most egalitarian anti-discrimination policies. No law says you have to sexually harass women when they go to work. No law says you have to discriminate against people of color or LGBT people or trans people even in most major cities, yet this is what's happening. So what's going on? And this is where I'm like, this is unconscious bias, and this is kind of the work that we as a humanity need to do to really evolve,
What I hear you saying is that there's a real connection between the unconscious bias and the system.
Yes.
And you talk a lot about systems towards the end of the book, Sharon, which I think then comes back to this idea of, we've been talking about systemic racism so much, but really finding the ways to address systems, beyond the personal is such a it's such a challenge. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it actually comes back a lot to what Anu started with because of this, that is, and it's almost a kind of mental training. I mean, he provides it, Anu provides it in his work. It's like, I've seen it so much that even as people move often through mindfulness, in a very classical practice, say, toward greater compassion, there's another facility of being able to look at systems. Like the example I use a lot, which I've seen so many times, is somebody will come to me and say, I started meditating and then I was taking a walk and somebody came up on the street and asked me for $1. And I gave them $1 because that is my general practice. But this was the first time I ever looked that person in the eye and realized it was a human being. So that is a huge transformation right there. But what I go on to say is that person may not then ask, what's the housing policy in this city?
Right.
That is having so many people live on the street? That's almost more like a kind of applied mindfulness, which again, is what I think on his work is really a wonderful example of. It's like, how do I apply it to see, in a way, look deeper? I use the example in the book of Sulak Shiva Rockstar, who's a Thai activist who came to visit here in Barre, Mass, which is where I am right now, home of the Insight Meditation Society, which is next door in that direction, now closed for the moment. And and somebody asked him about sex trafficking in Thailand, and he said, if you want to thwart or undo sex trafficking, look at agricultural policy. These farmers are starving. There's a reason why they may be selling their children. And it never left me, that idea. Like, look deeper, look for causes and conditions if you want to affect change in a bigger way. But that doesn't obviate, and I tried to make the point in the book, the one-on-one, person-to-person relief or presence or solidarity or help you may be offering one person. Because sometimes I think we go to that extreme as well and feel this is negligible, it's nothing, it could never be enough because I'm not upending this system of oppression, but it matters to that person. And it's perhaps how maybe we need like a big, big vision and a willingness to step by step do the good that's in front of us.
Yeah, and I think what I'd like to add to that is one of my big aha moments around this work was actually on retreat, probably with you, Sharon, years ago. And for me, I realized that when we talk about systems, when we talk about institutions, all of these systems and institutions are made up of people.
Mm-hmm.
And made up of people like you and I. And, so who are those people that design that agricultural policy? Who are those people that design those housing policies? And it's the level of consciousness that those people have that have really determined the course of action, that particular agency is taking. And for me, that's what my work has been about. It's really about helping decision makers who are making policies make all these things that are unconscious conscious. Helping these individuals really cultivate that level of empathy and compassion and perspective taking that makes them feel separate from people, from humans who are homeless or humans that are otherwise marginalized. So they can actually be able to design policy based on those individuals' lived experiences.
I'm really curious if you feel that there's the sense of the past being in the present, that there wasn't somebody right now who designed this, many of these systems of bias and racism that we've inherited. And yet we take them for granted and forget that we can design something else.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of race, human races, 4 or 5 races, such a recent phenomenon. I mean, of course, this, Rachel, because you study this so intimately, yet it has infected our global consciousness. And it was just a bunch of dudes that loved to collect skulls of human people and that came up with this story and created this arbitrary, artificial story that then was adopted by policymakers. Very similar to the story of gender, right? That story is, a few thousand years old, but we actually don't know why it is that we made this gendered caste system that has become a global phenomenon where we basically dispose half of humanity, right, from truly achieving their full, vibrant potential. And so these stories then become kind of fixed and then prevent us from actually living, with one another, and also from really being able to untap into our own potential. And that's what I think is the biggest tragedy of it all, on the one hand. But then I think about the retreats I've sat on with Sharon, and I'm like, well, that's why we do the work we do. Because if it was not there, then who would do that, What do you think, Sharon?
Well, I mean, it's such a, my mind keeps going back to the incredible delicacy of that work if you are in a place of privilege or power or decision making or leadership, because I keep thinking about I was in California for the month of February, and I keep referring back to it because it's now taken on epic proportions. Like I went somewhere, I was on a journey once in February, and I was doing a program, and there was a psychologist present in the program. And at one point, she said, "The brain filled with shame cannot learn."
Mm.
And I just find it such an interesting moment. It's like a moral reckoning. And at the same time, if somehow we spiral into just a kind of endless shame about it, we may not have the energy to learn, which is really the whole point, right? It's change and making change. So it's a very interesting process, I would imagine, in a direct confrontation with the bias we have held, or the actions we have taken, or the consequences for other people from the actions we have taken. And yet, how to have that sense of resilience, or moving on, or being able to actively work for change instead of shutting down in some way.
I so love that. The brain filled with shame cannot learn,
Yeah.
And I think this really goes because I read one of Brene Brown's books years ago, right before I started Be More. And as we were thinking about creating our learning journeys, I realized that we cannot induce shame in any of our programming, because shame prevents learning. Shame prevents behavior change. So I think, but I also think about all the people that are not learning right now, despite all of the clear evidence in front of them, whether it's around climate change, whether it's around inequity, poverty. And then I think about their bodies and their minds and the amount of shame that they carry within it, and how that shame that's within becomes projected outwards. So that's when it becomes an imponderable for me, Sharon. So I'm curious, like, in that moment, what can someone like me do? Like, I'm trying to hold compassion for people that are still supporting, let's say, the president of this country. Um, I try to feel compassion for those people that are marching as white supremacists, trying to feel into it. Yet, I know that this is causing harm. So, what can I do in that moment?
Well, I think that obviously it's a very complex issue, and I think we need to take action. We need to take the action that we are compelled to take. And I actually quote you in my book, kind of saying you realize you can't do everything. And
Yes.
so you put your energy and your dedication and your devotion into the actions that are calling you the most. And we must act. And I think it's not so much a question of actively, honestly trying to have compassion for those people we feel are causing endless harm. It's to, I think, refrain from hatred,
Mm,
which will just be devastating to us and debilitating. I think that the compassion, I think, is actually there. It's not that hard um, on one level, especially if you understand compassion as not being a force of weakness, and something that's going to just be like giving in, but to realize that it's a very powerful tool. But I think that part of the issue is that it was reflected in a program I was once a part of in Berkeley, California, and there were many, many people on that stage. And one of the questions from an audience member was basically, when I look at myself, my own experience, I realize that I cause harm from a place of pain within me. And yet I look at some of political figures that I really dislike and who I think are causing tremendous harm, and they don't seem to be in much pain. They seem pretty self-satisfied.
yeah.
And what was so interesting was that there were all these people on the stage as presenters, and there was just like complete silence. It's like no one wanted to answer. And I answered finally. I said, I'm with you. I feel like sometimes if they could just fray a bit around the edges, that I'd feel a more ready kind of empathy and compassion, which does not mean giving in. But I use my own experience as a laboratory. I do believe these actions come from a place of pain and huge disconnection. And I believe, right from my experience of the Buddhist teaching, that the capacity of a human being is for greatness.
Yes.
Not just mediocrity, and getting by and winning in a sort of conventional sense, that we have a capacity, each of us, for actual greatness, and to think about the choices that one can make so that one's life is that small and that divisive. And what I think these days is this terrible realization that for some people, their choices have led them to a life where if their terminal illness was announced today, a lot of people would rejoice. And I think, what a life.
What a life.
To have done that. I do feel compassion, but the compassion in no way holds one back from a kind of dedicated effort to see, well, yes, I do feel for them, and I wish that they could be free of suffering. And at the same time, I don't want them legislating my choices.
Yeah.
And so that's the work. And if you can't get to the compassion, that's all right. But if one gets lost in just bitterness and hatred, and it's just almost like another form of fear, and we're sunk, because we can't go on.
There's a great quote in your book. Actually, you're quoting Robert Wright, Why Buddhism is True, and it's about this, whether it's a kind of rationalization of situational versus dispositional. It's in somebody's genes, as it were, versus it's the situation they find themselves in. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I feel like that relates to what you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I will. And then I'd like to ask Anu about sort of the implications of that. He's talking about attribution bias. And the idea or the theory is that if someone we consider one of us, commits a crime or falls down in some way or exhibits something, bad, then we attribute it to the situation. Oh, well, they were just in a mess, or they had bad influences or something like that. Whereas if someone we consider part of the other does that very same thing, we think of it as like an intrinsic character flaw. Well, they're a bad person. They don't have the capacity to grow or to learn. This is who they actually are. And so we fix that action as a kind of deep part of their character. So do you encounter that, Anu, in your work, and what do you do about it?
I mean, absolutely. That's basically what's going on with a lot of the uprisings and protests around racial justice right now. They're timing, Breonna Taylor's story is just, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, you name it, all of these people, right? And then you still have people that are using this thing, attribution bias, to make excuses and justifications. And then the giving of benefit of the doubt to those individuals who actually took life, and the amount of harm and suffering those individuals have caused, not just the life of the people they took, their families and communities, but all of us as a society. So this is really kind of goes to the root of it. And for me, that's the work around really breaking bias. In this case, we're talking about breaking racial bias, but the foundation of racial bias is the belief in a story. And there's an incredible book that actually would be an amazing complement to real change, is this book called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson, where she goes to really describe the 8 pillars of any caste system that exists in the world. And when it comes to this idea of race in America, racism by itself is insufficient. It's insufficient to really describe the experience of all of us. What's really happening underneath of it, and underneath this, is this caste system, this unspoken caste system. And this goes to exactly what you're saying, this benefit of the doubt that is oftentimes given to people in the dominant caste. When it comes to gender, it's men, cis straight men. When it comes to sexuality, it's straight people. And when it comes to race and ethnicity, it's people who are white or European. So I think that's where I'm actually curious, Sharon, because there's something in the Buddhist text that talks about this idea of being better than or less than or equal to. And this is something that I've been deeply, deeply reflecting upon, because when we think about these caste systems, it's really that comparing mind, the judgmental mind. And I love that discussion in the book around, formation of judgment in our minds. But I'm curious, like, I'd love for you to just speak more about it, but also what are some practices we can begin to cultivate in ourselves to, make friends with this judgmental mind? Not get rid of it, but, transform it, transmute it.
Yeah, transform is probably better thought than getting rid of it, because it's not going anywhere. And I think that's actually an important point, that, you said it, Anu, when you talked about seeing your thoughts as thoughts. What we're really working toward is a sense of space, not to eradicate thinking or those stories or anything, because that's not going to happen. But if we have enough space, then we're not entangled, we're not enmeshed, and we're not overcome. And then we have a choice. Is this a thought I want to carry out, or do I want to let it go? And I think, so much power comes from how we pay attention, which is the whole theory behind mindfulness. It's like, we don't pay that much attention to one another. We don't really listen to one another necessarily. And so there's not very much basis for connection. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And, maybe especially now we're so physically isolated. Some people, not the people who are going out to work every day, but many are physically isolated. And it's all kind of weird, especially now. But even in ordinary times, we don't necessarily come together and listen. We don't have that sense of curiosity. And so much of that kind of layer of assumption can dissolve when we actually connect. And prior to that, or accompanying that, we need to be able to see thoughts as thoughts. So we need to be able to see assumptions as assumptions. I tell a story in the book about, it's one of those heavily disguised stories, so it always takes me a moment to figure out, like, what did I say actually? About a writer friend of mine who was on a book tour, and he was somewhere, he gave a lecture, and in the course of the lecture, he said how much Proust and remembrances of things past had affected him as when he was a younger person. So he gave the lecture, and then he was alone in a restaurant having dinner, and this group of people came in, and this woman of the group kind of split from the group and came over and approached him. And he took a look at her and he thought, she doesn't look very smart. She looks like she's poorly educated, probably kind of crass or something like that. And then she said to him, I went to your lecture, and his heart just sank. And then she said, I really liked it, but I have to say that I get so much more out of reading Proust in the original French, which was a moment, right? So we hold these assumptions, we don't even see them, and they govern our responses, our reactions, our actions sometimes. And it is such a power of mindfulness to be able to see, oh, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm projecting. Let me check it out. And that's not saying I'm a terrible person for holding this assumption. It's saying this is a conditioned reaction. And we want that choice. We want that sense of power. And one of the interesting reflections, I have not yet read Caste, but I'm going to, but one of the interesting reflections I've had is how, the Buddha, of course, arose in a society with a very strong caste system, and he challenged it in so many ways. And one of the ways he challenged it was really a kind of social revolution. these days, the Buddha's very strong emphasis on the intention or the motivation behind an action is also held in a kind of critical light because of the difference between intention and impact, which you can probably speak to. But at the time, what the Buddha was saying, he was living in a society where one's kind of morality, one's integrity, one's worth was very particularized based on caste and gender and so on. So what was appropriate and skillful and wonderful for a Brahmin male to do was forbidden to a Brahmin female or to a lower caste person. And so morality, good and bad, right and wrong, was all enmeshed in the caste system. And the Buddha came along and said, well, it's totally irrelevant. That means nothing. The only thing that matters is the intention behind an action. Are you coming from a place of greed? Are you coming from a place of love? That's what matters. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or, you know, upper caste or an outcast. It does not matter. And it was this huge uproar, you know, because everything that was said to matter, he said, none of it mattered. So intention in the time that he was speaking was really a revolutionary act. And so I wonder if you could just say something about intention and impact.
Yeah, no, I think, so I guess for people that may not know this debate, basically a lot of times, you know, we say something or don't say something, we act in a certain way, particularly around this idea of microaggressions, right? Unintentionally causing harm. So we're like, well, I had really good intentions, but if we've said something, the impact of that is still harmful to someone else. So that's where I think a lot of people, particularly folks that have been harmed, you know, people who are subordinate, whether it's on the gender hierarchy or the race hierarchy or sexuality hierarchy, are really speaking up and they're like, no, this is harmful. Like, you have to look into this. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Buddha here because I do agree with the Buddha. I think it is intention that, you know, trumps impact in this way, but it's actually the impact doesn't even occur. Because oftentimes, even if we have good intentions, it's very different to have good intentions versus having intentions that are colored by delusion, by ignorance, right? So a lot of times what we call good intentions are actually polluted by ignorance. And that's why, you know, it has the impact that it does, which is it causes harm. So, you know, I'm not an apologist for the Buddha, but I'm just stating the fact that in my lived experience, that happens to be true, which is what the Buddha said. You know, test it out for yourself. So that's how I see it. And I think here we're kind of in this human soup together. So like something that you'd said, which was really, that really resonated with me is that, you know, when we notice thoughts, we don't just become ashamed of having these thoughts. You know, it's a conditioned response. And that has been really helpful for me because, you know, I think this is part of the design of the system too. You know, I'm an organism that grew up in the system with many, many causes and conditions. And particularly living in the West, in the United States, we feel like, you know, this rugged individual and it's all up to me. And if I fail, it's my fault. But that's part of this larger narrative to keep us in guilt and shame, right? It might be our puritanical values of our ancestors. I don't know what it is. But that's, again, also ignorance, that's delusion. The part of like strengthening the mindfulness practice is to actually let go of these stories of perfectionism, of being right, and actually, Rumi once said that, beyond the field of right or wrong, or, beyond the right or wrong, there's a field and I'll meet you there. Like, it's really being okay with going to that field, beyond these stories of right or wrong.
Intention is such an interesting word to me because there's the idea of intention as in niyat, the idea that you're going somewhere and you're very conscious of it. I think Buddhism has that idea of intentionality. But then there's this sort of good intentions. It's a little bit like, well, I have good intentions, didn't you get it? It's not very deep, it's very superficial. And we use those words interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the intention, within the Buddhist context is a very, very important factor in an action. It's kind of a mystery, because only we can actually know our intention. And we know we can though, if we pay attention, if we're giving somebody a gift because we like them and we want them to have it, or because we see, oh, they have that really cool looking object. Maybe if I give them this, they'll give me that. Or maybe we're in front of a room full of people and we want to be seen as a generous person. Or maybe there's something kind of awkward or hard to utilize in what we're offering. We actually don't like the person and we're kind of here, have this. And it's the same gesture, it's the same smile, but it's actually coming from a totally different place. And so this is an arena of investigation for us. And it's not the end of the action. It's the spark. There's also the skillfulness or the unskillfulness of the execution. And so this is a lot what Anu was referring to. It's some sensitivity, it's some awareness of context, and including cultural context. And it's like a bigger or broader mindfulness. And that's important too. It's just not given the primacy of the force of intention. And but it's a big learning arena, and it's an arena where we can learn, which is kind of the good news. That's very exciting news, that we can learn skills of communication and understanding that is really possible for us. At the same time, we can see what our motivations are and decide where we want to go forward and what we want to let go of. That is another thing I used to say a lot going into companies or organizations to teach, is before a major meeting, before this big phone call, just kind of pivot your attention within and see, what do I really want to see happen the most? Do I want to be seen as right? Do I want a resolution? Do I want to be like a mentor? Do I want to be a help? Do I want to grind them into dust? And that will reveal a lot.
So I have an example here actually that might illuminate this idea of intention. This actually happened in a retreat with you, Sharon. It was a forgiveness retreat that we were attending. It was after a week-long metta retreat. And, I was really kind of, because there's so much space, right? And we're just with our thoughts and our minds, I was really investigating the ways I may have harmed other people, and at least forgiving myself for causing that harm. And in context of the work that I do, I remembered several occasions in my, I was probably in my early 20s at the time, when I had used the word white, to harm other people, right? So my mind was justifying it in all sorts of ways, privilege, access to resources, they caused me harm, great. Those things may be true, but then because I had so much spaciousness at this retreat, I was able to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the intention and the energy beneath that intention. And the energy beneath that intention was to dominate, was to cause harm. And once I saw that, well, I have this seed in me. It's not just something that's out there. I have it in me too. That's where, I could really begin to start the healing process. First, forgiving myself, which took a while, and then to actually seek forgiveness, or at least say that, I apologize. So at least there could be some atonement for that.
So last question, we're unfortunately going to have to end soon, but that really got me thinking about it. The role of forgiveness, and this idea, this book is called Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. So if you had a couple of last thoughts on that topic before I wind up, that would be great.
That is the biggest topic ever. It's very hard to a small thing. I mean, I think, again, we have to see what we mean by the word. One of my colleagues, Sylvia Borstein, one of her great quotations is, forgiveness does not mean amnesia. It doesn't mean wiping the slate clean. It means not being, Anu just gave the most beautiful example. It's not being lost in identifying with only one thing, in this case, forgiving oneself, not identifying with that act, that way of being, as though it were forever, and intrinsic to who we are. To understand forgiveness and the truth of change are very tied together. Not that we can decide someone else is going to change, but it's understanding that if we are consumed by the actions, in this case of somebody else, as somebody quoted to me who was just coming out of a period like that, he said, I let him live rent free in my brain for too long. You know, so again, it's about the freedom of one's own mind and heart. And it's really possible, I think, to come to these places.
I have nothing to add. That's so beautiful. Yes.
Yeah. I could talk on and on, but we're gonna take a pause, as we say these days. Perhaps, hopefully, some people will get the book, and you know, this is a great moment for some meditation. So first, I really want to thank both of you for being so generous, coming together. We will have this talk available online in the next day or so on Asia Society's YouTube, and we thank you all for being a part of this. I just want to let you know about one new program that's coming up on September 17th at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is a program that Asia Society is partnering on called Rise or Fall Together, One Shared World on Interdependent Summit. It's free, sign up, please register. It's a new group called OneShared.world. Some amazing speakers, as you can see here. And I think that the idea of interdependence is at the core of what we've been speaking about today, both in terms of our own being, but sharing this planet not only with other human beings, but with other beings. And actually, I love the Native American idea. You know, the entire Earth is a different kind of being. So to really think about that and to try to find solutions. So again, OneShared.world, you'll see the Rise and Fall Together Summit on the 17th. And I just want to finally say that we here at the Asia Society have been trying to pull together programs and part of the Culture Matters series and other programs. And we look to you for support. If you are able to donate, please do go to asiasociety.org. And in any case, your contributions are all part of our great interdependent moment. And thank you all for being with us, whether you're here at this moment or you're in the next moment in the pre-recorded or recorded moment. So you can see how this could keep going. But again, thank you, Sharon and Anu. It's been a delight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.